Okay, welcome back everybody. In the last episode, we poured the 3x3 concrete slab out the back of the main workshop, setting the foundation for some much needed storage space. But before we could start assembling the shed kit and clearing out all this clutter, there's just one more thing to finish inside the main workshop. I still need to frame up these final sections on either side of the roller door. It's a small job, but it's the last step in completing the wall framing and getting this space one step closer to being fully functional. At the moment, the workshop's so cluttered I can barely move in here, let alone use any of the machines properly. So the plan for this episode is simple: finish off the framing, get the storage shed up, and finally take back control of this space. So to kick things off, I'm putting together these final wall frame sections inside the workshop. As you can see, space is pretty tight in here at the moment, so I'm just working off a couple of old sawhorses I built back in my TAFE days. They're about 4 years old now, but they've held up well and still get used for all the rough carpentry jobs like this one. For these frames, I've ripped down some 90 by 35 pine to around 40mm thick. Since they're not structural, I just wanted to reduce the overall depth and keep everything a bit more compact. These are basically just simple stud frames with a single noggin through the middle, and they'll sit either side of the roller door. Once they're in, they'll tie into the existing wall frame and also fix back to the steel structure of the shed, while giving me enough room to run some architraves around the side access door. And with that, that's the final wall frame in place. It might not look like much, but it's actually a pretty big milestone. Every wall around the perimeter of the workshop is now framed up and ready to go, which means we're finally at the point where we can start thinking about cladding, ceiling, trusses, and really bringing this space to life. And honestly, it's a bit of a relief to have this stage done. It's taken a fair bit of time chipping away at it after work and on weekends, but it's all starting to come together now. So the next step is to build some proper storage. In the last episode, we poured this 3x3 slab out the back, and after letting it cure for about a week, it's now ready to build on. So now it's time to start putting together the shed kit, starting with the back wall. Now that this build's underway, I should mention this shed kit is actually from the same place I got the main workshop kit from, Easy Shed. This one's a bit smaller though, so it's a much simpler system to put together. It comes with a full instruction booklet, and instead of a structural steel frame with purlins, everything is formed by the panels themselves. The way it works is you connect all the wall sheets together, fixing them through the overlaps using the screws provided. And once that's done, you install these channels along the top, bottom and ends of the wall to stiffen everything up and hold it all together. It's actually a pretty straightforward process, but it still takes a bit of time to get everything lined up properly. So with this build, I'm not trying to rush it or smash it out in a day. The plan is to chip away at it after work, usually an hour or two each weekday, just focusing on one or two wall sections at a time. That way I'm not completely burning myself out mentally or physically after a full day on the tools. I found it works a lot better if I actually look over the plans earlier in the day, so when I get here I can just get straight into it and execute, rather than trying to figure everything out when I'm already tired. It does mean the build's a bit slower, but it also means I can take my time, check everything properly, and make sure each panel goes in square. Especially with these rebates in the slab, everything needs to line up nicely, otherwise it's going to cause problems later on. So it's definitely more of a steady, methodical build, rather than a quick one. It might not look like much day to day, but it all adds up. And looking back at the slab, we're actually really happy with how it turned out, especially for a DIY job. It came up pretty flat overall, which is exactly what we needed for something like this. The only real issue was a few leaves dropped on it while it was still wet before we got it covered. So there's a couple of small marks here and there, but nothing too concerning. We ended up covering it with a tarp for about a week while it cured. And once that came off, it was more than good enough for what this is going to be. Because at the end of the day, this is just a storage shed, but it's going to make a massive difference. The plan is to move all the offcuts out here, setting up some racking, and eventually build a sheet goods cart as well. That way I can store all my materials and timber out here, and finally free up some space inside the main workshop to actually work. By the weekend, I had a couple of wall sections ready to go, and with a bit more time up my sleeve, Dad and I started stripping the formwork off the slab. At that point, it had cured enough, but we still had to be careful, especially around the rebate sections. The last thing we wanted was to chip or crack those edges after all that work. But once we pulled the formwork away and exposed the rebates, it actually turned out better than we expected. There was barely any breakage, everything stayed nice and square, and for a DIY slab, it was more than good enough for what we needed. So with that done, it was just a matter of clearing everything out of the way and moving on to the next stage of the build, which in this case was assembling the roof sections and getting the ridge cap ready. So the roof panels go together pretty much the same way as the wall panels. It's really just rinse and repeat, same process over and over again. And once I got a couple done, I started to get into a bit of a groove. Less time reading the instructions and more just executing and recognising the pattern. I think that's a big part of construction. Once you understand the system, everything becomes faster and more efficient. At that point, it almost turns into a bit of a production job, where each panel is just a repeat of the last. The only real difference is the front section with the door. That one takes a bit more thought, but everything else is pretty straightforward once you get into your rhythm. With a few panels done over the weekend, I came back after work on the Monday and kept chipping away at the side wall panels. It had rained a little, so everything was a bit damp, but nothing that really stopped progress. This stage of the build is actually pretty important because it's right in the middle where motivation can start to drop off. There's not a huge amount of visual progress, just panel after panel going up, so it really comes down to staying focused and sticking to the plan. For me, that meant keeping the session short enough that I could stay sharp, and as soon as I felt my concentration slipping, that was it for the day. Go home, reset, and come back fresh the next day. It might not look like much at the time, but each panel adds up. And by the end of each session, it was just a matter of stacking everything down and throwing a bit of weight on top so it didn't go anywhere overnight. One thing that's really helped me stay consistent on a project like this is having something bigger to aim for. Not just building a shed, but building a space that actually looks good. Something I'm proud to work in and something that represents where I want to take Samurai Joinery in the future. This is what keeps me showing up after work, even on the days when I'm tired. Because every little session, whether it's framing, building panels, or working on side projects, it's all moving things forward. And I try not to think about the whole project at once, because it can feel pretty overwhelming. Instead, I just break it down into small steps, one panel at a time, one session at a time, and eventually it all adds up. And I can already picture it, having the shed set up, everything moved out from the main workshop, and finally having the space to move, to think, and to actually build properly. That's the end goal, and that's what makes it worth it. Before putting the door trim on, there's a quick step to sort out the hinges. The kit actually comes with a small U-channel jig, which clips straight to the trim and marks out the hinge positions for you. All I had to do was measure 150mm from the top and bottom, line up the jig and pre-drill the holes. From there the hinges just get pop riveted straight into the U-channel. It's a simple system, but it makes sure everything lines up properly once the doors are installed. Next up was assembling the doors. These are pretty simple in design, just a single sheet panel with U-channel trim running around the edges to hold everything together. To make things a bit easier on myself, I set everything up on the sawhorses with a plywood top, just to get it up off the ground and save my knees a little bit while working through it. When it comes to the door trim, the horizontals actually overlap the vertical channels at each corner, and once they're in position, I just run a screw through each corner to lock everything together and reinforce the joint. The only real difference between the two doors is on the right hand side. This one uses a jamb instead of a standard U-channel. It's more of a Z-shaped section, and that's what the left-hand door closes into once everything's installed. So apart from that small detail, the rest of the door build is pretty much the same process. With the doors assembled, it was time to move on to the front wall section. This is where everything starts to come together, building the front panel with the door frame built into it, and then fitting the doors in place. It's a bit more involved than the other panels, just because everything needs to line up properly for the doors to open and close cleanly. But once this section's done, it really starts to feel like an actual shed. But even though the concept is straightforward, this part actually took a bit more time than expected. The tricky part was getting the gaps consistent. Everything else went together really well, but dialing in the spacing and making sure the door sat nicely within the frame took a bit of fine adjustment. It really came down to tweaking the squareness of the frame, especially with the larger front wall section that ties it all together. It's one of those parts of the build where you slow down a bit, take your time and make sure everything lines up properly. To fit the doors, I used some 5mm packers underneath and give enough clearance for them to open properly, just as recommended in the instructions. The hinges are actually set up with the doors sitting in position on the frame while it's still on the ground, which makes it a lot easier to line everything up. From there, I just checked the gaps, top and bottom, to make sure they were consistent, roughly around 30mm. Once everything was sitting right, I added the internal Z sections to the doors, which helps stiffen them up and keep everything nice and rigid. With the doors and front wall section done, I now had all the components ready: walls, doors and roof panels. Everything I needed to assemble a shed. But I didn't want to rush into it. I knew this part was going to be important, so I waited till the next day to make sure I was fresh and focused before starting the install. With only an hour or two after work each day, I decided to break it into a 2-day process. Day 1 was all about getting the walls up and secured into position, and day 2 would be focused on the roof and finishing everything off. That way I could stay on top of it, take my time, and make sure everything went together properly. With the install underway, it was a bit awkward handling these 3-metre panels, especially with a bit of wind around. So I had Dad giving me a hand to get everything set up nice and square. We used a couple of timber props to hold each wall in place while we lined up the next one. And once we got into a rhythm, it was just a matter of fixing each corner together. The sheets overlap at the corners, so we ran screws through to lock the 2 walls together, and that was enough to hold everything steady as we worked our way around. From there, we just repeated the same process for each corner until all the walls were up and secure. Once everything was standing, I drove in a few temporary pegs around the base to hold it in position, with a plan to come back later and fix it down properly with concrete anchors. Once everything was up, there were a few small adjustments needed to get the doors working properly. The main issue was the Z section on the door. I'd left a little bit sticking out at the bottom, which was causing the door to bind from the inside. It was an easy fix though. Dad came in with a grinder and trimmed it back so the door could close cleanly. We also had a bit of binding near the hinges from the U-channel, but that was just a matter of tweaking it slightly with a pair of pliers to free it up. The rivets on the hinges were a little loose as well, so we added a couple more for extra strength, just to tighten everything up. And once that was all sorted, the doors were opening and closing nicely, exactly how they should. From there, we added the pad bolt to keep everything secure. The next day, it was time to get the roof on, and I'll be honest, it definitely wasn't as easy as it might look on camera. We had to really pull everything in tight around the perimeter to get the roof channels to meet up properly with the wall panels. So it was a bit of a process, pulling it down, clamping it where we could, and slowly working our way around with screws. and with each screw we put in, it pulled everything a little bit tighter, until we eventually had the whole perimeter sitting nice and snug, and fairly watertight. From there, we moved to the ridge cap. We fixed one side of it to a roof panel on the ground first, then once it was up in position, the opposite panel slots into it and gets screwed off from underneath the inside of the shed. We did notice a bit of sag through the middle while we were installing it, so we put a temporary prop up in place to hold everything up while we fixed it off. And once all the screws were in, we could take the prop out, and it pulled everything up nice and straight. To finish things off, I fixed the front section of the roof down into the U-channel of the front wall, and then did the same along the back, tying the roof into the rear wall panel. As well as that, I installed the end caps over the ridge, just to close off the gaps between the two roof channels and seal everything up properly. And with that, the shed was complete. It's been a really satisfying build to get done, because now, for the first time, I actually feel like I'm going to have some proper space to work in. Being able to move materials, offcuts and tools out here is going to make a massive difference inside the main workshop. And it's a big step forward for Samurai Joinery, creating a space that's not just functional, but set up properly for the future. So stay tuned, because in the next episode, we'll start clearing out the main workshop and getting it into a space that's actually ready to build in. If you'd like to follow this workshop fit out series, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.